Today we're talking about solving quadratic equations by taking square roots, and we have a few ideas that we want to look at. First of all, if d is a positive number, then x squared equals d has two solutions, and that would be equal to x equal to the plus or minus square root of d. X squared equals 0 has one solution, and that would be just x equals 0. If d is negative, then x squared equals d has no real number solutions because you can't take the square root of a negative number and still get a real number back. So for instance, let's say we want to solve this problem. Basically, just like when you're solving equations, what you want to do is get the x squared term alone. So 3x squared equals 21. So we'll start by dividing each side by 3. So we have x squared is equal to 7. Now, if you have a variable squared equal to a number, what you're going to be doing, basically, is taking the square root of both sides. So basically, you're taking the square root of each side. Now, when you take the square root, you do get both a positive and a negative answer. So this is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 7. When you take the square root of x squared, you just get x. So you end up with, now we can't take the square root of 7 and get a whole number, and we can't really simplify it in any further. So we end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of 7 as our answer. And most people jump from the x squared equals 7 just to the next one. I'm just showing you that you are taking the square root of both sides. Now let's say we do this next problem. We want to get x squared by itself, so we're going to add 5 to each side. So the 5's cancel, and I have 4x squared equals 14. I'm going to divide each side by 4. So I have x squared equals 14 over 4. Now, we want to get x squared by itself. So basically, we're going to take the square root of that number. So x is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 14/4. Now remember, that's the same thing. We can separate the numerator and the denominator with square roots. This is the same thing as having plus or minus the square root of 14 over the square root of 4. Now we can actually take the square root of 4. That gives us 2. So we have plus or minus the square root of 14 over 2. We can't take the square root of 14 and get a whole number, and there's really no way we can break that down and simplify it. So we end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of 14 over 2. Let's do this next problem. We've got 3x squared minus 5 equals 9. So we're going to add 5 to each side. So we have 3x squared equals 14. I'm running out of room, but I'll put it right here. We need to divide each side by 3. So we get x squared equals 14 over 3. So we need to take the square root of 14 over 3. So we have the square root of 14 thirds. Keep in mind, we can separate those. I'm going to move this up here. So x equals plus or minus square root of 14 over the square root of 3. Now, we cannot take the square root of 3, and we know we can't simplify the square root of 14 either. We do have to get rid of the radical in the denominator. Remember, you can't leave that there. So we're going to have to rationalize by multiplying both the numerator and the denominator by the square root of 3. Now, in the denominator, square root of 3 times square root of 3 just gives you 3. In the numerator, we need to say 14 times 3, which gives us 42. And we still have our plus or minus here. And you want to ask yourself, is there a way that I could simplify the square root of 42? And I could break it down as 6 times 7, but I can't take the square root there, or 21 times 2, and I can't take the square root of that. So actually, we are stuck with this. X is equal to plus or minus the square root of 42 over 3. Now let's move on to our next problem. When an object with little air resistance is dropped, its speed continually increases. The height h in feet of such an object is given by the model h equals negative 16 t squared plus s, where s is the height from which the object was dropped, and t is the time in seconds it has fallen. How long will it take an object to hit the ground if it is dropped from 975 feet? So let's start with our equation here. H equals negative 16 t squared plus s. Okay, now h, the height of the object is 0 if we want to know when it hits the ground. S is the initial height of the object from which it was dropped, and we know that was 975 feet. So let's plug our numbers in. So we have 0 equals negative 16 t squared plus 975. Now we're going to solve for t, which will tell us how many seconds it takes for that object to hit the ground from when it was dropped at a height of 975 feet. So we're going to solve for t. We'll start by subtracting 975 from each side. So we have negative 975 equals negative 16t squared, because the 975s do cancel. I'm going to make this a little neater here. Okay, now to solve for t, we want to divide each side by negative 16. So we have t squared equals, well, negative divided by a negative is a positive, 975 divided by 16. And if we divide that out, I'm not going to keep this in radical form, because if you're asking how many seconds it's going to take or how long, you probably want it more as a decimal, something that'll make a little more sense to you. So 975 divided by 16 gives you 60.9375 is equal to t squared. And now we want to take the square root of that. Now, and we'll write plus or minus in front. So if we take the square root of that, and I'm going to round it to the nearest tenth, we get the time is just about, and actually I'm going to change the equal sign to an approximately sign just to show that we have rounded it. We get plus or minus 7.8, and we're talking seconds here. Now we see right off we've got a little problem with this, because can you have a negative number of seconds? And maybe in some sci-fi adventures you can, but not here in real life. So no, we actually are going to have to throw away the negative answer and just deal with the positive answer. So we're going to say t is approximately 7.8 seconds. Okay, so it takes 7.8 seconds for the object to hit the ground after it's dropped from a height of 975 feet. Let's go on to the next page. Let's solve x minus 7 in parentheses squared equals 25 by taking square roots. Now, we want to get x alone. I'd like to get rid of the squared sign, and I know this is probably a little bit different, but if you need to get rid of something that's squared so that you can actually get to what's inside the parentheses, just take the square root of both sides here. So since this entire side, this left side of this equation was squared, I'm just going to take the square root. But what I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. Now keep in mind, when we take the square root of 25, we're going to end up with plus or minus for our answer. Alright, so we end up with x minus 7, because if you take the square root of something squared, you just get what's left inside here. So we have x minus 7 equals plus or minus 5. So basically, we've got two situations. We've got one where x minus 7 equals positive 5, and x minus 7 equals negative 5. So let's go ahead and solve that. Okay, so basically you've just got two equations to solve. So the first one, we just add 7 to each side, so we have x equals 12. The other one, we still add 7 to each side. And when we do that, the 7's cancel and we get x equals 2. So we end up with two answers here. So either x is going to be 12 or x will be 2. And that's fine for us to be having two answers here. Now, this next one, this is a literal equation. Let's solve the Pythagorean theorem for side B. Remember, this is for right triangle. So if we wanted to find one side, the length of one side of a right triangle using the Pythagorean theorem, and it was not the hypotenuse, let's say it's side B, what we're going to do, solve for B, let's start by subtracting a squared from each side. The a squareds cancel on the left. So we have b squared is equal to c squared minus a squared. Now we want to get b alone, so we're going to have to take the square root. Now keep in mind, b is the length of a side in the Pythagorean theorem. So I'm going to just write the length of a side. Okay, because it's the length of a side, we're not going to have both the plus or minus version. We're just going to have the positive version of c squared minus a squared. Because basically, I'm going to draw a picture here. So here's a right triangle. Let's say this is side A, B, and C. C is the hypotenuse. And this is the formula we would use to find the length of side B. So if it's the length of a side, it cannot be a negative number. And we're going to have to leave it just in this form because we cannot take the square root of c squared minus a squared when we don't know what they are. And notice these are being subtracted, so you just can't go ahead and take the square root of c squared and the square root of a squared. You actually would have to do that operation of subtraction first before you took the square root. So we get b equals the square root of c squared minus a squared. Thank you for joining me, and that is all for today.